Good day, and welcome now as we look at the upcoming scriptural readings for this weekend, the 30th Sunday or weekend of the year. We're still in the A year, the Matthew year. We have this, including this week, 5 more opportunities to celebrate the liturgical year. First reading for this time comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verses 20 through 26. The second reading comes from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 1, verses 5c through 10. And the gospel is from Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. Now, as we mentioned last time, having told 3 parables in which Jesus challenged the authorities, namely the scribes and the elders, now pictures 4 what we would say controversy stories that Jesus is pictured as engaging in the temple area. He has now completed his journey. He's in the temple. And of those 4, as we mentioned, 2 of them will be part for our consideration. The first was last week, which you remember, or last time, which was the issue concerning the census tax, whether or not it should be paid. And you remember it was the story of the coin with the image on it, and Jesus referring to the fact that what belonged to Caesar should be Caesar, what belonged to God belongs to God. The second of those controversies is not going to be one for our consideration this time. It involves the Sadducees presenting Jesus with, and I'm sure you're familiar with this story because it is highlighted particularly in the gospel tradition of Mark, in which Jesus is presented with the famous Levirate law, whether or not if one of the brothers should die and without an offspring, is it not the responsibility of his brother or a close relative to have relationships with the widow, his widow, the deceased brother's widow, and that the offspring conceived there would be his, that is, the deceased brother's heir. So you remember that turns out to be a rather interesting, where to make your attention gathered 7 times, and 7 times the boy dies, and finally the wife dies. And so the question raised is, whose wife will she be? Now that again, notice that each of these were attempts on the part of the questionnaire to trick Jesus or test Jesus with regard to his response. The Sadducees, and that of course was part of the issue, did not believe in a resurrection of the dead. They're hold that when a person died, the soul perished also with the body. So they stood in opposition to the thinking, you remember, of the Pharisees, who did hold to a resurrection of the body. So Jesus challenges the questionnaire by saying, well, when you die, there's a different kind of relationship set up. And secondly, why are you doing this? Because if you pay close attention, that in the Bible it mentions that God is the God of the living, not of the dead, and therefore you Sadducees should be paying attention to this. So that's a little bit the story that will be missed. Now we come to the third, and that's the one that we're going to look at this time, which is found in verses, as we mentioned, 34 through 40. Here he is questioned this time by the Pharisees, or by and we put this a little bit in parentheses, a lawyer. Now, always remembering that a lawyer in those times was not the kind of legal lawyer that we think of, but really was a teacher of the law, therefore someone who should have been quite familiar with the Torah or the law of God. So in that sense, lawyer, law, get it? Okay. So what is the greatest commandment is the question that is raised or given to Jesus, asked by the tester. And Jesus responds by giving, really, if one thinks about it, what would have been considered and still is a traditional answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets. So in a way, certainly as I mentioned, it was a very orthodox response, a very traditional response, and as been noted on a number of occasions, the uniqueness of Jesus' response is to link two of the commandments. The first, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and with your mind. This a little is an addition that Matthew makes, comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 5. So that's where that part comes from. And then the book of Leviticus in chapter 19, verse 18, says you'll love your neighbor as yourself. So that is the uniqueness of Jesus' response. This, of course, is known even today as the Shema prayer, very traditional, observed even in the home of many Jewish members to this day. This particular section is one of the most, as I said, most well-known and also most discussed. It is a continuing example, or an example of this continual cultural game in which there is challenge and response. So Jesus is challenged, now we heard his response. What was well known, and just again a little bit of a review of a background with regard to this issue, the Pharisees had identified by the time that Jesus lived, and even now later when Matthew writes it, had identified that there were 613 commandments in the Torah or in the law. So in that sense, asking which is the most important did make some sense. When this is analyzed, were known to be 248 positive commands. They usually began, thou shalt, and 365 negative, thou shalt not. So when you add that up, you come to the 613 commandments. Now, here's the interesting question, how would anyone be expected to remember all of them? And how would anyone really be able to, in a quick time, be able to figure out which of those was the most important or more important than others? In fact, taking this kind of question, discussion had broken out, and some pointed out that when they classified these 613, some were classified as heavy commandments and others as light commandments. So, for example, a heavy command would be one of the 10. Thou shalt keep holy the Sabbath day, honor your father and mother, etc., okay? Those would be considered heavy. Light, well, these, and they had to search around for these. One example of this might be found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22. I just give all this background, not that you're going to check it out, but at least that you know where it comes from. Reads this: a person who finds a bird's nest with a mother sitting on eggs, or with a young, may take the young, but must leave the mother go. All right. Now that's, talk about a command, okay? Considered to be a light command. Other customs developed around this was to sum up the Torah's commandments in small numbers so that they would be easily remembered and accepted. So examples of this would be, King David proposed that there were 11 important commandments. And if you check Psalm 15, you will see where this is found. Isaiah argued that there were 6 important commandments. And this would be found in chapter 33, verse 15 of Isaiah's work. Micah, another prophet, said there were 3. And this would be found in his chapters, verses 6 through 8. And Amos argued, another prophet, of course, argued that there was 1. And this was found in chapter 5, verse 4. So there were different ways in which, and I give you all of this kind of background, which you won't hear, certainly I think on Sunday, but to see that the discussion did kind of intrigue those who were interested in this. And then, of course, there was the famous teaching of Hillel, who we believe was a contemporary, certainly of Jesus, or shortly after Jesus' time, who said this when asked about what was the great commandment. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, while the rest is commentary. So go and learn it. So that's what Hillel said, okay? And he phrased it, notice, in the negative, where Jesus also once prescribed earlier on in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 7, said this, in everything do to others what you would have them do to you. This is the law and the prophets. So in a way, Jesus had already, according to Matthew's story, given that answer, but now this is the response that he gives to the questionnaire. Now, to love God and to love one's neighbor. It perhaps is important to notice here how love is understood. I think we often think of it in a more emotional kind of way, but that the Mediterranean cultural world did not think of love exactly in that same way. Love was what you gave, the loyalty that you gave to a group. And it helped to, the loyalty you gave was illustrating a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, and offered advice for the actions to be taken. So in that way, you loved the group, you loved the family. Notice that it isn't here understood as love of individual for individual. And that's often the way in which we in the Western world tend to understand and appreciate love. So love in this sense, again, going back to the biblical point here, is an external, deals with the external conscience. And this exerted enormous pressure on individual members. Hence why there is this love-hate relationship. If you love, you are attached to your group. If you hate, you are disallowed or disadvantaged from your group. So whether or not it was an emotion or an affection was beside the point. So to be loving here, and this is perhaps the important message, is to be totally attached to God, or to be totally attached to the community. So to love one's neighbor is total, okay? And all of this revolves around what is called a circle of friends. So I mentioned this as we're looking at it, that when we say love God, love one's neighbor, that there's a totality here, but it is not based on just how you feel. Do you feel like loving? Is not what is understood in the teaching at this point. So very simply, he has answered the question of the questionnaire, and that would be the third of the four controversies here. We'll finish up by going back to the fourth, but at this point, let's look at the first reading from the book of Exodus. Now, what is found in chapter 22 that is offered for our consideration this time is perhaps the oldest collection of laws in the Hebrew Bible. This little section, sometimes known as the Book of the Covenant. And quite likely, these laws originally developed as individual laws, and then over a period of time were gathered together sometime before the monarchical period. Now, again, we need to have a little bit of background here. Remember that the monarchy traditionally begins with Saul, David, and Solomon. Roughly, we would date this around 1000 before the common time, or the millennium before Jesus' time. So already these laws were known within the communities or tribes of Israel that had settled in the Holy Land. Expression of God's will is what these laws were, but the code would have been developed by the individual community or the individual leaders. Now, one of the section that we hear this time, again, this whole discussion about the larger development of the codes of Israel, the law of Israel, the Torah of Israel, is a much larger discussion and certainly involves a lot more of issue. But why, when we look at the little section that's offered this time, why are the resident aliens, the widow and the orphans, singled out for special attention? And the reason for this is that they illustrate or represent the poor. Also, they are singled out because each of these would be in a temporary situation, namely that they had lost status. And of course, one wants to honorably have a relationship in the community. Now, I'll give all this background because in some ways, of course, one can see how it's related to the gospel that we're listening to. So this temporary loss of status, what does that mean? The alien is living apart from his community of origin. The widow, of course, has lost her husband. The orphan has lost a parent. None of these states of life were viewed as permanent. The alien was expected to take action so that he could return to regain his status in his community. The widow either would remarry or return to the care of a father or brother. The orphan would be moved to another kin. So you see, the condition of these three conditions of persons would be temporary. Therefore, the prohibition is against molesting or oppressing or wronging these people. It is a prohibition against thwarting their efforts to regain their lost status. So you have to put all of that together to see why these illustrations are used. Israel, it was remembered, were once aliens in Egypt. What about widows and orphans in their own setting? Hence, to treat others as they would be treated is what is the point of this situation. Now, all of that is a lot of background for the choice of this little section from the book of Exodus for our consideration. It goes on also to say that it makes an argument against lending money to anyone except to fellow Hebrews. So keep it within the family. There is, of course, a whole development later on, well beyond New Testament times, in which the Jewish community would be lending money to Gentiles. But the argument here is against what we call usury. You cannot charge more than what is expected upon return from the person who you gave the money to. And finally, the cloak issue, you remember that the cloak was, he's told, you cannot keep the cloak overnight because for many of the poor, the cloak was his home. It was his protection against the cold. And therefore, if you took the cloak as part of a payment, you had to return it each night. Now, I don't know how that worked, but that, of course, is the ideal here. So all of that is based on the little section from the book of Exodus that is presented for our consideration. We turn now to the fourth challenge that, remember we said there are four, so we've looked at the first and the third. The fourth is an interesting one. This time, Jesus is pictured as raising the question, kind of turning the tables, as it were, on his questioner. And Jesus then says to them, that is, to we assume it would be the Pharisees and the Herodians who were there. And of course, we always remember that the audience, again in the temple area, is not unaware of what's going on and may well be listening. What is your opinion about the Messiah, says Jesus. Whose son is he? Now, a debate concerning the scripture, of course, was always popular and was always expected. But why does Jesus raise this? Because in Psalm 110, it begins, and this was known as a coronation psalm. We believe that this psalm was used when a king was brought before the community to be publicly kind of crowned, if you want, made the king. This is the psalm that was used. And the psalm says that David is chosen by the Lord, but is he also the Messiah? So if David is inspired by the Spirit, calls the new king Messiah and Lord, then he must be simply more than his son. So you got to get all of this. The Messiah, if you kind of follow where this is going, would be the son of David. And this, of course, is found in Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 10. Jeremiah also in chapter 23, verse 5, gives the same thing. So what is being implied is Jesus is pushing this question to his questioners, is that Jesus must be more than simply the Son of Man. He must be the Son of God. And so that, of course, is, at this point, the questioners ask no more questions. So this, which we will not hear, but is the fourth of the challenges, if you want. Now, as I say, the challenge has been redeveloped by Jesus to challenge his questioners. So, to love God with all one's heart, to love God with all one's soul, points out that all of the other, and this is what we've been looking at, all of those other 613 kind of hinge or hang on them. In some way, in order to truly appreciate this, one ought to notice that all of those, whether they're heavy or light, commandments in some way should reflect and articulate love either of God or love of neighbor. So that is, of course, what is brought at the point here. I do point out that this whole question of the 613 may have been, part of the world of Jesus' time and the Pharisees of Jesus' time, but they are found in the Talmud, which is the official, you remember, interpreter of the Torah, of the law. But that was not put in place really until the 3rd century. The first of those, the book of the Talmud, was known as the Mishnah. We've mentioned this before. And then the Talmudic tradition develops. So, to what degree these 613 were known or practiced in Jesus' time remains somewhat of a point of discussion. We like to say that they were, and they may well have been, but if we're looking at the written sources for this, we have to recognize when the composition of the Torah was done. We also have to recognize when Matthew is writing his gospel, as we mentioned a number of times, some 50 years after the time of Jesus, and certainly after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. We kind of go back to that often because much of the way in which the message of Jesus would be understood should be seen against the contemporary time in which the work was written and the audience to whom it was, again, directed. Certainly by the time that Matthew is writing, whatever influence the Herodians had was gone, and so that the real leaders, as we noticed on a number of occasions within Judaism at this time, were the Pharisees. And to say that there was an absolute difference between what Christian Jews believed and the Pharisees of the time believed might be drawing it a little bit too strictly, that there was a great deal of agreement. But where the disagreement occurred, and which of course is the basis for this whole reading and for all of our discussion here, is that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the laws, of all of the teachings that had come to Israel, that Jesus brings them to a new level, that Jesus is the new teacher, he is the new Moses. But now, this kind of interesting image, is it not, that Jesus is also the son of David, but is the Son of God. And this now brings to, as I mentioned, brings to an end the discussion that goes on in the temple area with regard to the authority of Jesus. And that, remember, had been the question that had been raised. Whose authority do you have to do what you are doing, to teach what you are teaching, and to act in the way that you are acting? And this love God, love neighbor epitomizes and in a certain way brings to a fitting conclusion that the authority to do this comes from none other than God, and that Jesus, as the Son of God, is truly the Messiah, and he is the one who brings the true message to a new dimension, to a new level, and to this time. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.